What is going on, Tampa Bay? Welcome to the Tampa Business Spotlight. And I know everybody's been talking a lot about the hurricane, Irene, everything that's coming. We've actually had this podcast booked for a couple of weeks. I have a very special guest on today. It just so happens with all this hurricane talk, but we have Mike Puffer with Florida Strategic Insurance is going to be on, and we're going to take a real deep dive into what's going on with flood insurance, all the changes, what to do to be prepared if a storm does hit, and how to take action. So I'm really excited to have Mike on. One thing before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our show sponsor, shameless plug here, but Sakkis Group is a show sponsor. So the Sakkis Group has been helping people buy, sell, and invest in residential real estate since 1992. If you guys would like to see all the available homes that are for sale in the Tampa Bay market, visit sakkisgroup.com. And like I said, since 1992. So a couple of notes, just a little quick housekeeping as well before I bring Mike on. We are streaming this live on several different pages and several different channels. So if you guys want to comment, what we're going to do is once we get Mike on, we'll have the main show, the main comments. But then if you stick around towards the end, we're actually going to be doing live question and answer at the end of the show. So if you have any specific questions, we're going to go over a lot of stuff on the show, just questions in general. But if you have anything specific that you'd like to ask Mike about insurance, go ahead and go to our Facebook page, which would be, if you're on Facebook right now, you search for Sakkis Group at the top. That's going to be the main feed. So if you post your comments into that Sakkis Group feed, I will be able to see them, and we'll also be able to share them live on the show. So any comments that you have, go ahead and throw them in the comment box, and we'll get started. But like I said, very special guest, Mike Puffer with Florida Strategic. I'm real happy to have him on. So without further ado, let's bring Mike on the show and welcome him to the Tampa Business Spotlight. Welcome, Mike.
Nick, good afternoon. How's it going?
Good, man. Good. How are you?
Incredibly busy, but
Right.
good. This is, I guess, what we do in insurance. When we have a storm coming this way, we have to make sure that we're there for our clients. So
That's right.
A lot of emails and phone calls right now.
So how many phone calls have you actually got? I know we had a conversation earlier, and it's been pretty tremendous so far, right?
Yeah, yesterday, just an interesting dynamic, the way that everything went. So Irma really wasn't a concern at all until over the weekend. And Governor Scott issued a state of emergency for the state of Florida. And that just started a whole downward spiral of people kind of, rightly so, trying to prepare themselves for a pretty big hurricane, but also, expediting and speeding up the process, which normally doesn't happen until maybe 4 or 5 days before a hurricane's going to hit. Harvey is a good reason, or a big reason why that happened. So when Rick Scott declared a state of emergency, a lot of the insurance companies, even though the storm was 1,400 miles away, they started restricting binding before Tuesday even happened. Most people were off for Labor Day the day before. So our office, we had, I would easily say around 1,000 phone calls yesterday.
Wow.
About people wanting to purchase flood insurance,
Of course.
wanting to know that they had flood or wind coverage if that were the case, wanting to know the correct numbers to dial if they are in that situation, or what are they supposed to do. So it was all hands on deck yesterday, and it was I can honestly say it was the busiest day that I've had insurance in my entire career.
Sure.
And it was an interesting day. It slowed down a lot today, so I'm glad that's now slowed down.
Well, it's interesting you said that. That's kind of one of my first questions I had for you to start off the show here. We talk a lot about, you kind of hear that term hurricane in a box, but you just kind of mentioned it yourself. But what exactly does that mean when you say, the hurricane is in the box or anything of that sort?
Well, that used to be a guideline. There was I believe it was like a 600 square mile box that went around the entire state of Florida. And what happened, as soon as a tropical storm or any type of catastrophic storm hit that box, binding restrictions would be restricted for the state of Florida. Well, they've changed that. There's not really a box anymore.
Okay.
An insurance company can start restricting binding whenever they feel they want to restrict it. A lot of times they'll do it by county. So where they might be restricting binding, if there's a hurricane in the Atlantic, in Miami-Dade, Monroe, they might not be doing it in Pinellas County. So it gave them a little bit more of an opportunity to not close down the entire state. Because when you affect binding, probably know that on the real estate side, it could delay a transaction if a policy wasn't bound.
Absolutely.
So there are a lot of instances where they try to keep it open as long as they feel they can before they restrict it. So the box is gone. And a lot of the companies, they'll follow what Citizens does within the state. They'll start restricting binding when Citizens does. And then when the governor issues a state of emergency, that also gives the insurance companies some leeway to start restricting binding. And now we're seeing, I think there may be only one or two companies that haven't restricted or stopped binding until the storm passes right now.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So, obviously everybody's focused on Irene, and, we don't know exactly which way it's heading so far. Or Irma, yeah, sorry. My apologies. We're on I. Yeah. So, one thing that I wanted to go over, if something does happen, so let's say a storm hits and you do have flood insurance, how quickly can you make a claim after a storm? What's the process? And, how long does it take?
So there's a number that everybody that has a flood insurance policy has a number that they can call. It's listed on their policy, which is their claims number. They immediately want to call that number and at least get the claim notified and try to get an adjuster out there as soon as possible. They need to protect their home as much as they can. If they're not, if they've decided to evacuate, because it's a lot safe to do that, then just filing the claim and trying to get that process started is the best thing that they can do. Just from a perspective of being ready, you want to make sure you have the ability to have cash on hand or credit to stay in a hotel. If it's if you're looking at Hurricane Harvey as an example, a lot of those people were displaced, and they're going to have to foot the bill for every single one of their costs out of pocket until they can file a claim. Sadly, flood insurance doesn't have the loss of use coverage where they'll pay for living arrangements elsewhere. But if we're going to have a serious hurricane come this way, we're probably going to have damage from wind as well, and that your homeowner's policy, most all of them include loss of use coverage, so that'll help you with it if you have any costs that are associated with having to stay in a hotel or finding living arrangements. But you have to pay for all of that up front. You'll get it in the end. It might take a long time to do that. But the first and foremost, file a claim with your carrier, find out what that contact number is, and call them as soon as you know that there's damage to get them to get out there.
Gotcha. So that was actually one of the questions I had too. Is basically, do you have the ability to have coverage for a stay in another location? So that definitely answered that. As far as possessions for flood insurance, what exactly would be covered?
So it covers, so if you have contents coverage on your flood policy, it's going to cover anything within your structure that's not built into the main structure of the home. So I tell people all the time, if you were to be able to pick your home up, turn it upside down, anything that falls out is going to be considered contents coverage.
Oh, I like that.
That's what's going to be covered on your flood policy.
Yeah.
For the most part, we're talking all about the government's product, the NFIP. In the state of Florida, we have 1.8 million policies that are underwritten by the NFIP. There's 1.8 million policies in the state of Florida. Most of those are written by the NFIP. They were really the only game in town before the Bigger Waters legislation was passed, and that really pushed private market solutions in. Now we only have around 20,000 private market insurance policies in force in Florida, so just a fraction of the overall exposure. But those policies can add a lot more coverage than the NFIP's policy covers. I'm going to be speaking mainly about the government's product because that's what most people have, and the coverage through the government's product is not that great. So your dwelling, the actual structure of your home, the government offers coverage of underlying of up to $250,000. So if you have a loss, they're going to pay the replacement cost to the home based on the flood damage up to $250,000 worth of coverage if that's what you have on your home. And then your contents, the most that they'll offer is $100,000, but they only value that at actual cash value. So if your couch is 4 years old, they're going to depreciate the amount they give you. So it's not the best coverage on that side. So again, your home policy, what you have in a lot of these instances, you have damage from wind. Say a branch goes through your window, rain comes in. That's going to cause damage that's a hurricane peril. Flood, the only loss is rising water from the outside in. And sometimes there's an argument between the two adjusters, the flood adjuster and the home adjuster, on who's responsible for covering the loss. And that's in those instances, it could take a long time to get that claim closed, and it could also bring in the legal system to make sure that everything's good. So again, it's important to know all of your different avenues of where you can go to protect yourself and make sure that you have funds to do that.
Gotcha. And that kind of leads me into my next question. You touched on that a little bit, but if you don't have flood insurance, you just have regular homeowners insurance. So that would be the constant fight between those two, right? Is what you were saying is, if your window gets blown out, but there isn't necessarily rising flood water, how do you prove where the damage came from?
Right. And again, in past instances, because that's really what I can speak to, when you have a judge that will rule, and again, this is past experiences, that if there's a water line within the home, so water has risen up to a certain point, we've seen it ruled to where any damage that is below that water line is going to be considered flood damage, and any damage above that line is going to be considered part of the home, the hazard policy that you have. So at that time, it is kind of frustrating. You have two policies. You're going to have potentially 3 deductibles because your flood policy, you have a deductible for your building. If you have contents, you have a deductible for your contents. And then your home policy, you're going to have a percentage deductible. Typically, it's 2% if you're going to have any type of wind or hurricane damage. So you could be coming out of pocket a substantial amount of money if you do have a flood and hurricane wind loss.
Gotcha. And as far as the actual property is concerned, so I'm sure people have heard this term before, but the elevation of a property is very important when it comes to the actual flood insurance, right? So can you explain what an elevation certificate is, why you would need one, and what its use is?
Sure. So an elevation certificate is a document that states how high your home is above sea level. It will also tell you what flood zone you're in, and a lot of times it'll tell you what height flood zone you're in. So an elevation certificate on our side is used to accurately rate the premium for somebody that's purchasing a home. Any person that's purchasing a home that is going to get a loan on their home, if they're considered to be in a high-risk flood area, that's any A or B flood zone, is going to be required to carry flood insurance. If the home is post-firm means that it's post-flood insurance rate mapping. So that home was built in that community after the flood program existed. So that home has to be built to whatever that current requirement is. Let's say that it's 9 feet above sea level and the ground is 3 feet, so the grade of the land is 3 feet. For a certificate of occupancy to be issued for that home, the home has to be, the first living floor has to be at least 9 feet above sea level. So it's just used as a tool to make sure that it's adhering to the FEMA's guidelines to make sure that the home is not in a high risk area. And typically, that's if a home is within a 1 in 100 year floodplain, that's when flood insurance is going to be required by a lender. And the flood zones that are determined by FEMA are supposed to at least put the first living floor just outside of that 1 in 100 year floodplain. So the elevation certificate tells you where that home is in relation to the flood zone. And a lot of times it can be very beneficial for the person to get one if they're not required to get one and they want flood insurance, because the higher they are above that number, the less expensive that flood insurance policy is going to be.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think we heard a lot of buzz when all this stuff started changing over, And, there was some people talking about, well, now finally the quote unquote rich people on the water are going to pay their fair share. But then it's a catch-22, right? Because if you're building a new construction house or in a newer house, you're above that base flood elevation. So you can have a multi-million-dollar house and not pay a huge amount of money because you're above that base flood. Meanwhile, a single family rancher in South Tampa that's from, 1952 has got this huge flood insurance bill because it was below the base flood elevation.
Absolutely. And that's what the legislation, what Bigger Waters was trying to do, is to get the program to be fiscally sound. Well, what they didn't take into account is what the repercussions would be of taking away all of the measures that were put in the previous flood bills. So to your point, a lot of the people that were adversely affected with very high premiums are the ones that didn't have the high homes or the high value homes. And a lot of those homes, most of the homes, weren't even on the water, to your point. So, it is just the nature of the risk. We live in an area that we're surrounded by water. So
Sure.
Flood is definitely something that can happen. We want to make sure that it's rated properly. But yeah, when the legislation was initially passed, it was passed basically stating that people that live on the water have money and they can afford higher premiums, which is not the case at all.
Gotcha. Now, what about for the people who are listening to this and say, well, my property's grandfathered in, so I have nothing to worry about. What would you say to those people?
Something could change. You don't know with the new piece of legislation that comes out. That was one of the things that the Bigger Waters legislation was looking to remove, was grandfathering a home. And what that means is that is when a home is built in compliance with whatever FEMA's guidelines is. So I'll give you an example. Home built in 1974, so it's post-firm. The flood program through the government existed. They said, hey, before you can issue a certificate of occupancy on this home, we need to make sure that the first living floor is at 8 feet. So they built it at 8 feet. They got the approval. Person lived in the house. FEMA comes back out and remaps the flood zone. Now all of a sudden it's 10 feet. The home is now 2 feet below where it should be built. So what they're saying is that home was built in compliance to the rules at the time. So we're going to grandfather them back into where they have an even rating with the flood, and they're not going to be penalized 2 feet below the flood insurance. Well, part of the legislation was, no, all of these homes have to be actuarially rated or rated off of the potential disaster. We're not going to take into account the way that it was built. They're going to have to pay the higher premium because they're not at where they should be. Now, there are a lot of lobbying groups that are trying to keep grandfathering within the policy. And I think they're going to be successful in the end. But nothing is off the table right now. And with what happened with Hurricane Harvey, it's going to be interesting to see if they try to expedite reauthorizing the program. Because again, the Bigger Waters legislation was passed. It was a 5-year bill. It was meant to stabilize the flood program. Really didn't do that. There's still $24 billion in the hole. And that piece of legislation expires on September 30th. As of October 1st, effectively, there is no more government program. You can't issue any more new policies. There's not going to be any renewal offers that are going to be granted. People that do have policies in place, they're still going to pay a claim if that's the case. But before there's a reauthorization, there's going to be a moratorium on the government product. Thankfully for Florida, because it has been profitable for as many years as it has been, there are a lot of private market solutions, and a lot of lenders are accepting them. So we just kind of have to wait and see what happens.
That kind of leads me into the next question. What do you do if you're closing on a house in October? Do you just wait and see what happens, or what would be the procedure?
So what our agency is doing right now is we're providing 2 quotes through the most competitively priced options. We're providing a quote through the NFIP, through the government's program, and we're also providing a quote with a private market solution. We are urging the insured, our potential clients, to share that with their lender to make sure that they qualify from a debt to income ratio if they have to go the private market solution, if it is in fact more expensive. So we want to make sure that both of those bases are covered if that program isn't reauthorized. So it's more being proactive than reactive, and thankfully there are those private market solutions right now.
Right. And with that private market coming on stronger, I mean, what do you see? What do you anticipate? Do you see it going completely private, or what do you think the changes are going to be?
I love competition, and I think
Sure.
that the more private companies, more private market companies that are coming in are going to create a better environment for the consumer, because people are going to be competing for risks and they're going to be writing them in. And the private market is going to adjust the pricing to where it is actuarially sound. The government still, I don't think, is getting it right. And just to tell you a little bit, the private market came in because the government is now not rating homes based upon the risk of there being a flood. They're assessing up to and above 100% of a policy premium if it's not somebody's primary home, if it's a rental property or a secondary property. So they're not rating it on the potential that there's going to be a flood loss. They're rating it on the occupancy of a home. And I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I don't really think that if it's a secondary home versus a primary home, there's any more of a risk that a property is going to flood. So the state of Florida, again, has been profitable for the NFIP. We subsidize the entire rest of the country when it comes to flood insurance. So Florida is where all these companies are starting to form, and they're starting to discount the rates that the NFIP is charging, and they're starting to get a lot of the market share. Again, this new piece of legislation that they're trying to get passed is supposed to guarantee that the private market solutions are going to be accepted by the government lenders, the Fannie and Freddie, and that's kind of up in the air as well. So the current administration, what I've heard, I spoke with David Altmaier, who's the head of the OIR for the state of Florida recently, and they're trying to promote private markets as much as possible. And the current administration likes competition. So I don't see anything changing to stop the private markets. And in the end, it's going to be the best thing for the consumer. Now, are they going to take over all of the risks? No. The government's going to have their place. There's a lot of risks that the private market doesn't want to write. And it's not that the private market's just trying to take all of the quote unquote profitable policies that are there. They're underwriting them to make sure that they're rated properly. But a private market doesn't want to continue to insure a home that has a flood loss every 2 to 3 years, because that's not insurance.
Sure.
So one of the other things that this new bill, when they pass it, when they reauthorize the program, is going to look to do is to find a way to incentivize people to build their home to whatever the current code is. And there's a number of different options on the table, and it would take me a long time to go through all of them, but they're at least trying to head in the right direction. I hope that they don't pass anything too quickly because of what happened with Harvey that ends up being more detrimental than it is good. So again, we just wait and see what's happening.
Right. Do you think with all the stuff that just happened in Texas and that recent hurricane, what we're about anticipating in Tampa Bay, is that going to play a factor in the new bill that's passing, or do you think it's just they've already got it set and the parameters are already set?
It's definitely not set because, again, our experience with the government is they're reactive rather than proactive. So you're going to have the bill that's going to it's set to expire on the 30th expire, and they're not going to pass anything until after October 1st. That's just, when you look at what's happened in the past, that's normally what happens. Now, Houston is a very interesting place. We write insurance specifically and only in Florida. Florida is a very unique animal. I don't really know much about Texas, but apparently they haven't adhered as strongly to FEMA's guidelines as a lot of the communities within Florida has. I saw and heard a number that only 13% of the homes in Houston and in the surrounding areas have flood insurance. Wow. Only 13% of the homes. So the bad for the people is they're going to be stuck if their home, in fact, had a loss due to a flood. And again, well, let me go back a little bit. So a lender requires flood insurance for a 1 in 100 year flood. Any home that's within a 1 in 100 year flood. Anybody that's out of the 100-year floodplain, when we speak with them, they always tell us, well, we're not in a flood zone. Well, everybody's in a flood zone. It's just how likely is that going to happen? Now in Houston, there were areas that were affected in the 1 in 500-year flood and 1 in 1,000-year flood in Houston. So you had a lot of people that didn't think they had flood insurance or were in flood zones that had flood losses. So it's terrible for those people, but it's actually good for the taxpayer and the NFIP because they're not going to sustain nearly as big of losses as they would have if everybody did have flood insurance. And the number of the total loss that I just saw was equal to what Katrina and Sandy were combined. So I heard the total loss or the total damage for that area or that storm was $194 billion, which is just insane.
Yeah.
So hopefully it doesn't negatively impact, again, the legislation that's going to be passed. But Florida is different. I mean, you almost have to think of Florida as a different country. So we're doing things much more different than they are in Texas and any other state. So I don't know. I'm sure there's going to be effects with what happened in that area with Florida. But again, we're waiting.
Makes sense. And real quick, guys, we got a couple of people watching live. So if you are watching live and you do have a question for Mike or myself, make sure you're on the Sakkis Group Facebook page. That's the only way that I can see your comments for the show. So if you're on Facebook, go to search sakkisgroup.com or just search Sakkis Group, and the video will be live, post, or pinned at the top, and you can ask your questions on that live feed. So, Mike, that brings another question for you. You said you only write insurance in Florida, but who is your ideal customer? Are you guys specifically residential? Do you do commercial? Who is your ideal customer?
So, our focus as an agency has been new purchase home business. So we're a personal lines agency. The cornerstone of what we do is on home and flood insurance. We write auto insurance, personal lines, umbrellas, but we stick in the personal line side of things. And we just want to be the best resource and advocate for our clients and the most knowledgeable about what it is that we write. So again, why we're speaking today is because this is what I live and drink every day is home and flood, what's happening within the market, who's competitive from a company standpoint, who's coming in, who's going out, and what's happening from a legislative perspective that could affect our customers. So our focus is that personal lines, and it's all derived from home and flood.
Gotcha. Okay. And, one of the things I like to ask everybody too on the show, obviously we're reaching a broad group of people, and you obviously have a very successful business. You guys are doing very well. Do you have any future plans? Are you guys looking for talent? Is there anybody that you would like to bring on your team that you'd be looking for?
Absolutely. We're always looking to grow. We feel like we have a model that has been very successful to people that work with us and the people that we work with. So we look to form relationships with real estate agents and lenders and people that are purchasing homes and provide them with the best solution. We're in a growth stage right now, and I'll tell you, it is. We know there are a lot of good people out there. Sometimes it's kind of hard to find them, but we're always looking to speak with people about the opportunity.
Very cool. And I'll flash Mike's contact info here on the screen so you guys can see. You can send him an email directly at michaelp at floridastrategic.com, and that is the office number is 727-546-6000. And one thing before we go. So we covered a lot of great information, right? There's a lot of very, very good flood information, which I definitely appreciate. One thing I like to do towards the end of the show is something called the lightning round. So in order to kind of
I can talk about insurance, but the lightning round
is a little bit frightening, right? So this kind of lets everybody know a little bit about your personality. Obviously, we know about your business. So let's get to know Mike just a little bit. So lightning round, first question. One of my favorite questions is, what is your favorite movie of all time?
I would probably have to say Braveheart.
Braveheart. Okay.
It comprises a whole bunch of different genres within one, and the guy's a badass. So,
nice. So is that like your Halloween deal? You get the face paint and everything, and the kill?
I haven't done that as of yet, but that's not a bad one.
Not a bad idea. Okay. And so, kind of on that same topic, who was your favorite superhero as a kid? Who do you identify with?
I mean, Superman. The guy's indestructible. fly. It doesn't get much better than that, in my opinion.
Nice. If a 6-year-old walked up to you on the street and asked you if Santa Claus was real, what would you say?
Of course. Yeah, I
Of
have
course.
2 young kids, and their innocence is one of the most fun things to be around. And when they have a belief in something like that, there'd be no way that I would say otherwise.
Very true. I have a 1-year-old at home. I also have some older kids at home as well, but we like to keep Santa Claus in the mix for sure. Everybody's got a stocking, right?
Yeah, I think when I was younger, I was probably 9 or 10. I told my cousin that Santa Claus didn't exist, and I think that I paid a very heavy price for that from my parents. And there was a lot of so yeah, I wouldn't want anybody to experience that.
Wow, nice.
I regret I have in my life.
And last question for the lightning round: if you were on death row, what would be your last meal?
Honestly, it'd be anything that my wife would cook. She's probably
what a good answer. Holy cow.
We were talking about that the other day, and it really is like she's so meticulous with everything that she does, and she wants everything to be perfect. And I was thinking about this. You think lightning round, you're like, what are the questions that can be asked? And that would be I know that's kind of a political answer, but that's the truth.
That's definitely the safe answer. Very safe answer. Well, Mike, I definitely appreciate you taking some time with us here, man. This was some really, really good information. Again, guys, Mike Puffer with Florida Strategic Insurance. If you need to get a hold of him, Michael P at flstrategic.com. Numbers on the screen. Also, their website is flstrategic.com. So you can find out some more contact info there. Mike, usually we do question and answer at the end, but it looks like we don't have any questions. So I guess that means that you answered everybody's questions and crushed it, right?
I must have.
Very good, man. So I definitely appreciate it. Thanks for being on the show, and we'll keep in close contact, and definitely appreciate it, buddy. So take care.
Thank you so much, Nick. All right, everybody be safe. Be prepared for this.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks.
Take care.